For 30 years, Johnny Carson reigned as the undisputed king of late night, welcoming Hollywood's biggest stars into America's living rooms with his trademark charm and impeccable timing. But behind that perfectly orchestrated Tonight Show facade lurked television's most unpredictable wild card, celebrities who'd had a few too many before the cameras started rolling. In an era before publicists micromanaged every interview and social media could instantly document a career-ending gaffe, stars would sometimes arrive at NBC's Burbank studios 3 sheets to the wind, creating moments of television both legendary and cringeworthy. Today, we're counting down the 8 most notoriously intoxicated guests ever to slur their way through the Tonight Show moments that network executives wished they could forget, but viewers never would. From Oscar-winning legends who couldn't remember where they were to Hollywood icons who nearly fell off the famous couch, these weren't just awkward interviews. They were live television teetering on the edge of disaster. And what's most fascinating is how Carson handled these unpredictable situations, sometimes with grace, sometimes with visible frustration, but always with a quick wit that made him a legend. So pour yourself something strong, though perhaps not as strong as what these celebrities had, and enjoy the countdown of Johnny Carson's most memorably inebriated visitors. What made these drunken Tonight Show appearances so remarkable wasn't just the spectacle of seeing famous faces under the influence. It was watching how the unflappable Johnny Carson navigated these unpredictable situations. In an era of live television with no editing safety net, Carson had to think on his feet when faced with slurring Oscar winners, rambling directors, and celebrities who might say or do absolutely anything. Some hosts might have panicked or cut interviews short at the first sign of trouble, but Carson typically employed a masterful mix of gentle redirection, strategic commercial breaks, and witty asides to Ed McMahon that acknowledged the elephant in the room. Without embarrassing his guests, of course, not all interviews could be salvaged, and some celebrities found themselves permanently crossed off the Tonight Show guest list after particularly disastrous appearances. Let's explore 8 unforgettable examples of when Hollywood's brightest stars arrived at Studio One in Burbank, having clearly made a few too many stops at the bar along the way. When Truman Capote walked onto the Tonight Show set in 1980, viewers immediately sensed something was amiss. The brilliant author of In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, known for his razor-sharp wit and incisive observations, could barely navigate the short distance from the curtain to the guest chair without stumbling. What followed was perhaps the most uncomfortable 17 minutes in Tonight Show history. From the moment Carson welcomed him with a standard, "It's great to have you with us tonight," it was clear Capote was severely intoxicated. His response, intended to be a witty greeting, emerged as a nearly incomprehensible mumble that had Carson leaning forward with a strained, "I'm sorry, what was that?" The awkwardness had only begun. Throughout the interview, Capote slurred virtually every word, often to the point where even Carson, a master at understanding guests through their nervousness or accents, appeared genuinely confused about what the author was trying to say. When attempting to discuss his latest work, Capote launched into a rambling anecdote that veered wildly from topic to topic, eventually landing on a bizarre story about Montgomery Clift that seemed to have no beginning, middle, or end. The studio audience, initially excited to see the famous writer, grew increasingly uncomfortable as the interview progressed. Nervous laughter erupted when Capote, apparently forgetting he was on national television, suddenly turned to Ed McMahon and asked if he could sit in the announcer's lap. "Because you look so comfortable, like a teddy bear." McMahon's stunned expression became one of the night's most memorable moments. Carson, ever the professional, tried valiantly to steer the conversation toward coherence. He repeatedly attempted to focus Capote with specific questions about his writing process or literary influences, lifelines that Capote consistently failed to grasp as he drifted into increasingly bizarre non sequiturs. The low point came approximately 12 minutes into the segment, when Capote attempted to take a sip of water and nearly missed the glass entirely, sending water down his chin and onto his shirt. Rather than acknowledge the mishap, he continued speaking as if nothing had happened, now with a large wet spot on his chest visible to millions of viewers. As the interview mercifully approached its conclusion, Carson signaled for an early commercial break, a rare move that he reserved for only the most dire interview situations. The camera caught him exhaling with visible relief as it cut away, a moment that wasn't supposed to be broadcast but made it to air. Due to the director's delayed reaction, Backstage after the show, Carson reportedly told his producer that wasn't an interview. It was a hostage situation in slow motion. True to his word, Capote never appeared on The Tonight Show again during Carson's remaining years as host, despite the author's literary stature and previous successful appearances. What made the Capote incident particularly uncomfortable wasn't just his obvious intoxication, but the contrast between his brilliant public persona and the incoherent figure viewers witnessed that night. It represented a painful public glimpse of the demons that would eventually contribute to Capote's declining health and career in his final years, a stark reminder of how substance abuse could undermine even the most towering intellect. On national television, if Johnny Carson maintained an unofficial ranking of his most challenging guests, Shelley Winters would undoubtedly have secured a place near the top. The two-time Academy Award winner was famous for her dramatic performances on screen, but her appearances on The Tonight Show often featured a different kind of drama, the kind fueled by pre-show cocktails and a complete disregard for the normal rules of television interviews. Winters' pattern of arriving at the studio well lubricated was so consistent that Tonight Show staff had a standard protocol when she was booked: place her in the second or third guest position rather than the opening slot, hoping she might sober up slightly while waiting backstage. This strategy rarely succeeded, as Winters typically continued drinking in her dressing room until the moment she was called to the stage. Her most notorious appearance came in 1974, when she was ostensibly booked to promote her autobiography. From the moment she walked on stage noticeably unsteady in heels, that suddenly seemed to high viewers knew they were in for an unusual segment. Carson had barely finished introducing her when Winters launched into a rambling story, completely unrelated to her book, interrupting him mid-sentence. What followed was television chaos. Winters talked over Carson repeatedly, cut off his questions, and at one point turned to directly address the studio audience as if Carson weren't there at all. When he attempted to steer the conversation back to her book, she dismissed his question with a wave of her hand, saying, "Oh, Johnny, nobody cares about that. Let me tell you what happened with Marlon Brando instead." The situation deteriorated further when another guest, a young actor promoting his first major film, joined them on the couch. Rather than allowing Carson to interview him, Winters continuously interrupted, at one point placing her hand on the visibly uncomfortable young man's knee while telling him he reminded her of a young Errol Flynn. When the actor attempted to answer Carson's question about his film, Winters loudly announced, "His movie isn't very good, but he's pretty to look at." Carson, normally the model of composed professionalism, showed rare visible frustration. Viewers could see his jaw tightening as he repeatedly tried and failed to regain control of his own show. At one point, the camera caught him shooting a desperate glance toward Ed McMahon, who merely shrugged helplessly from his sidekick chair. The breaking point came when Winters, apparently feeling that Carson wasn't being attentive enough to her stories, reached over and snatched his note cards from his hand, tossing them over her shoulder while announcing, "You won't be needing these, Johnny. I'm much more interesting." The cards scattered across the studio floor as the audience gasped. After finally managing to end the segment with another early commercial break, Carson reportedly told his producer, "If she's ever booked again, I'm taking that night off." True to his word, Winters disappeared from the Tonight Show guest list for nearly 3 years, an extraordinary blackout period for an actress of her stature. When she eventually returned in 1977, it was under strict conditions, including a noon interview time for the taped The Late Show, making extensive drinking beforehand less likely, and an understanding that any similar behavior would result in a permanent ban. As one staff writer succinctly described her approach to Tonight Show appearances, she didn't sip, she stormed. What made Winters' drunken appearances particularly challenging was that, unlike some intoxicated guests who simply became incoherent, she became more dominant, louder, more opinionated, and completely unwilling to follow the basic conventions of a talk show interview. In Carson's carefully orchestrated television world, she was the hurricane that no amount of preparation could contain. Dean Martin's entire public persona was built around an affable, slightly tipsy charm, the martini glass in hand, the slightly loosened tie, the gentle sway as he sang. These were all elements of a carefully crafted image that had made him one of entertainment's most beloved figures. For years, insiders insisted that Martin's drinking was mostly for show, that the glass often contained apple juice rather than alcohol, and that his drunk performances were largely an act. On The Tonight Show, this cultivated image served him well during multiple appearances throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Martin would arrive seemingly half in the bag, charm the audience with slurred one-liners, and generally play up his reputation while actually delivering polished, professional entertainment. Carson was in on the act, often setting up opportunities for Martin's drunk humor with questions like, "How much have you had to drink tonight, Dean?" But something changed by the mid-1970s. Those close to Martin noted that what had once been primarily an act had gradually evolved into reality, with the entertainer increasingly turning to actual alcohol to cope with personal struggles, including the tragic death of his son and the collapse of his marriage. This painful transition from performed intoxication to genuine impairment became undeniably apparent during the 1976 Tonight Show appearance that remains one of the program's most uncomfortable moments. Martin was booked as the lead guest, supposedly to promote an upcoming NBC special. From the moment he walked through the curtain, however, it was clear something was different from his usual Dean Martin character. Rather than his trademark controlled sway, Martin stumbled noticeably on his way to the guest chair, nearly missing it as he sat down. His eyes appeared unfocused, and the slight slur that had always been part of his charm was now so pronounced that several of his first responses were nearly incomprehensible. Carson, who had introduced Martin with his usual enthusiasm, quickly registered that something was wrong. The interview veered off course almost immediately when Carson asked about Martin's upcoming special. Rather than providing the expected promotional response, Martin looked genuinely confused and asked, "What special?" When Carson tried to remind him about the NBC program, Martin responded with, "Oh, I thought I was here to talk to Merv," apparently confusing The Tonight Show with rival program The Merv Griffin Show. Carson attempted to salvage the interview with his usual quick wit, joking, "Well, Merv's not here tonight, but I can put on a wig if it would help." The audience laughed nervously, but Martin didn't seem to register the joke, instead staring blankly at Carson before asking, "What time is it?" Despite the interview being barely 2 minutes old, what followed was 7 excruciating minutes of television, with Carson desperately trying to guide Martin through basic conversation, while the legendary entertainer drifted further into confusion. At one point, Martin began singing "Everybody Loves Somebody" unprompted, stopping mid-verse to ask if the show was being taped or broadcast live. The most revealing moment came when Carson, seeking any coherent response, asked Martin about his famous golf game. Martin briefly perked up, starting a story about playing with fellow Rat Pack member Sammy Davis Jr., only to suddenly stop and ask, "Where's Sammy? Is he coming on next?" Despite Davis not being booked on that night's show at all, Carson mercifully brought the segment to an early close, thanking Martin and quickly introducing a commercial break. The camera lingered just long enough to capture the genuine concern on Carson's face, as a production assistant helped Martin from the stage. Backstage, according to multiple staff accounts, Carson was uncharacteristically shaken. Dean made drunk look classy until it didn't, he reportedly told his producer. That wasn't the Dean Martin we know. Despite their longtime friendship, Martin's appearances on The Tonight Show became significantly less frequent after this incident, with Carson apparently reluctant to risk another such uncomfortable situation. What makes Martin's case particularly poignant is how it revealed the thin line between a celebrated public persona and a private struggle. For years, audiences had laughed along with Martin's drunk character, never suspecting that the act would eventually give way to a much sadder reality played out on national television. Raymond Burr commanded unparalleled respect in Hollywood throughout the 1950s and 1960s as television's Perry Mason the Unflappable, morally upright defense attorney who never lost a case. Burr had established himself as the very embodiment of dignity and professionalism. His imposing physical presence combined with his resonant voice created an aura of authority that made him one of television's most trustworthy figures, all of which made his disastrous 1970 Tonight Show appearance all the more shocking for viewers. Accustomed to seeing Burr as the pinnacle of composure, the incident began with a bad omen. Burr arrived at the studio nearly 40 minutes late, forcing Carson's production team to hastily rearrange the evening's schedule. When he finally appeared backstage, staff members immediately noticed he was visibly intoxicated, a state virtually no one associated with the strictly professional actor. Carson, already irritated by the scheduling disruption, was reportedly told about Burr's condition just moments before the actor was set to come on stage. According to production staff, Carson briefly considered canceling the segment entirely, but ultimately decided that sending away a star of Burr's magnitude would create even more problems. When Burr finally walked through the famous Tonight Show curtains, the contrast between the Perry Mason that viewers knew and the man who appeared before them could hardly have been starker. His normally immaculate appearance was disheveled, tie askew, hair uncharacteristically mussed, and face noticeably flushed. He gripped the back of the guest chair momentarily to steady himself, before sitting down with a heaviness that made the furniture visibly shift. Carson began with a general question about Burr's current projects, likely hoping to ease into the conversation safely. Instead of discussing his work, however, Burr launched into a rambling monologue about his orchid collection, a genuine hobby of his, but one that had nothing to do with Carson's question. For nearly 10 excruciating minutes, Burr expounded on orchid cultivation, breeding techniques, and his greenhouses in Fiji, occasionally losing his train of thought mid-sentence only to start a new, equally tangential topic. The audience, initially excited to see television's beloved Perry Mason, grew increasingly uncomfortable as Burr's speech became more slurred, and his points more disconnected. Carson made several attempts to redirect the conversation toward Burr's career, but the actor either didn't register these prompts or deliberately ignored them. The situation reached its nadir when Carson, clearly desperate to salvage something from the interview, asked Burr about his experiences playing Perry Mason. Rather than offering the expected nostalgic reflection, Burr stared at Carson for an uncomfortably long moment before asking, "What did you say your name was again?" Despite having been introduced by Carson just minutes earlier, and despite Carson being the most recognized talk show host in America, Burr seemed genuinely unable to recall who was interviewing him. The audience's nervous laughter quickly faded to awkward silence. Carson, visibly stunned by the question, recovered with remarkable grace, extending his hand and saying, "Johnny Carson, pleasure to meet you, Mr. Burr." This moment of quick-witted damage control became one of Carson's most legendary examples of grace under pressure. After the interview finally concluded, Carson reportedly told his producer, he went from courtroom legend to cocktail liability in one night. The incident marked not only Burr's last appearance on The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure, but also represented a turning point in how the program vetted guests before airtime. According to staff members, Carson instituted a new policy requiring production assistants to personally interact with every guest shortly before their scheduled appearance, with instructions to alert producers if anyone seemed impaired. What made Burr's drunken appearance particularly jarring wasn't just his celebrity status, but the complete contradiction between his public image and his behavior that night. For millions of viewers, Perry Mason represented unwavering competence and moral authority. Seeing the actor behind that character so completely out of control created a cognitive dissonance that many fans found difficult to reconcile, a stark reminder that the line between a beloved character and the person portraying them could sometimes be far wider than audiences realized. Orson Welles represented a unique category in the pantheon of Tonight Show guests. Unlike celebrities who appeared primarily to promote their latest projects, Welles was welcomed as a genuine intellectual Renaissance man whose conversations with Carson often elevated late-night television to something approaching high culture. Their discussions typically ranged from Shakespeare to politics to the future of cinema, with Welles holding forth in his magnificent baritone while Carson played the role of the educated, curious host. These intellectual showcases made Welles's occasional appearances under the influence all the more striking. While most guests might try to hide their intoxication, Welles seemed almost to celebrate his, arriving with the confidence that his immense intellect and charisma could overcome any amount of alcohol in his system. His most notorious Tonight Show appearance occurred in 1975, during a period when the once svelte director of Citizen Kane had reached his full physical expansion. Backstage reports indicated that Welles had consumed multiple bottles of wine before the show, not unusual for him. But on this particular evening, the effects were unmistakably visible. When he walked on stage, Welles was sweating profusely under the studio lights, his face flushed and his movements more labored than usual. He settled into the reinforced guest chair, reportedly specially constructed for his visits, and immediately launched into conversation without waiting for Carson's first question, a breach of talk show protocol that few guests other than Welles could have attempted. What followed was what one Tonight Show writer later described as a masterclass in drunk eloquence. Despite his clearly inebriated state, Wells began an extended monologue on the significance of Shakespeare's problem plays, occasionally slurring words, but never losing the thread of his complex literary analysis. The performance was simultaneously impressive and uncomfortable, a brilliant mind clearly operating through a significant alcoholic haze. Carson, recognizing both the value and the potential disaster of the situation, largely stepped back and allowed Wells to continue what eventually became a 14-minute uninterrupted speech. The monologue veered from Shakespeare to Wells's experiences in the theater, to pointed criticisms of contemporary Hollywood, occasionally circling back to earlier points in a way that suggested Wells himself had lost track of his argument. The audience's reaction was mixed throughout this extraordinary segment. Some appeared genuinely fascinated by Wells's erudition despite his condition, while others seemed unsure whether to be impressed or concerned, as he occasionally paused mid-thought, visibly struggling to find words that would normally come easily to him. The turning point came when Wells attempted to quote from King Lear, but couldn't recall the exact lines. Rather than acknowledging the lapse, he created what appeared to be entirely new Shakespearean-sounding dialogue on the spot, delivered with such authoritative conviction that only Shakespeare scholars would have recognized the fabrication. This impromptu Shakespeare continued for nearly 2 minutes, before Wells smoothly transitioned to another topic as if nothing unusual had occurred. By the segment's conclusion, Carson's expression had transformed from initial interest to visible exhaustion. When Wells finally paused for breath after his extended intellectual odyssey, Carson glanced at his watch and simply said, "We need to take a break," a rare moment of unfiltered reaction from the normally unflappable host. Backstage after the show, Carson reportedly remarked to his producer, "The genius was there. The sobriety wasn't." Despite this assessment, Wells continued to be welcomed back to The Tonight Show. Unlike some other inebriated guests who found themselves permanently banned, the difference, according to one NBC executive, was simple. Even drunk, Wells was more interesting than most sober people could ever hope to be. This tolerance for Wells's occasionally intoxicated appearances reflected a different standard applied to guests perceived as genuine artists or intellectuals versus those seen primarily as entertainers. While Carson had little patience for actors or musicians who couldn't maintain their professionalism, he seemed to accept that Wells's occasional excesses came with the territory of genuine brilliance. A reminder that in television, as in other fields, different rules often apply to those considered true geniuses. Zsa Zsa Gabor built her career on a carefully crafted persona, the glamorous Hungarian bombshell whose accent was as thick as her jewelry was expensive. With her trademark darling and flirtatious manner, Gabor was a Tonight Show favorite, reliable for delivering entertaining, slightly risque banter that perfectly complemented Carson's straight man reactions. Usually, Gabor's appearances followed a predictable pattern. She would sashay onto the stage dripping in jewels, exchange playfully suggestive remarks with Carson about her multiple marriages, plug whatever project she was nominally promoting, and leave the audience charmed by her exotic European glamour. But on one memorable night in 1973, this familiar routine went spectacularly off the rails due to what appeared to be a pre-show encounter with significantly more vodka than was advisable. Trouble signs were apparent from the moment Gabor emerged through the curtain. Her normally precise runway walk was noticeably unsteady, with one stiletto heel nearly catching in the carpet as she made her way to the guest chair. Carson, ever the gentleman, rose to assist her, a courtesy that Gabor acknowledged by attempting to kiss his cheek, but instead landing somewhere closer to his ear. Once seated, Gabor's usually manageable accent seemed to have doubled in thickness, rendering some of her initial responses nearly incomprehensible. Carson, quickly recognizing the situation, shifted to questions requiring simple answers, but Gabor insisted on delivering lengthy, meandering responses that frequently lost their way before reaching any clear conclusion. The situation escalated when Gabor, apparently feeling that her position on the couch wasn't close enough to Carson, attempted to slide nearer to him mid-answer. This maneuver nearly ended in disaster as she momentarily lost her balance and began to tip sideways. Carson quickly reached out to stabilize her, a move that Gabor interpreted as an invitation for physical affection. "Johnny, you are trying to make the moves on me," she declared loudly before launching herself toward him for another kiss. This time she managed to plant a bright red lipstick mark directly on his mouth. To the delight of the studio audience, Carson, normally unflappable, appeared genuinely flustered as he reached for his handkerchief while Gabor giggled uncontrollably. Beside him, attempting to regain control of the interview, Carson introduced a prop he had planned to discuss, a book about Gabor's famous sisters. Rather than commenting on the book, Gabor seemed distracted by her own jewelry, suddenly extending her arm toward the camera and announcing, "Look at this bracelet. Darling's worth more than all the NBC executives combined," before dissolving into laughter at her own impromptu joke. When Carson gently tried to steer the conversation back to the book, Gabor responded by placing her hand on his knee and asking in a stage whisper, clearly audible to both the studio and home audiences, "Why talk about boring books when we could discuss your bedroom, Johnny?" The audience erupted in shocked laughter. While Carson's face registered a rare moment of genuine alarm, the interview continued its unsteady course for several more minutes, with Gabor alternating between moments of her usual charm and increasingly unpredictable behavior. She repeatedly interrupted Carson's questions to either compliment his appearance or make vaguely suggestive comments, each time inching closer to him on the couch, until he was nearly pressed against the armrest in retreat. The breaking point came when Gabor, attempting to emphasize a point about her latest divorce, tried to stand up for dramatic effect. The combination of stiletto heels, tight dress, and compromised balance proved disastrous. As she began to topple forward, Carson and a quickly responding stagehand managed to catch her before she fell completely. But the near miss clearly signaled to Carson that the segment needed to end with remarkable grace. He thanked Gabor for coming while signaling for a commercial break, adding that they needed to continue this conversation another time. Television code for this interview is over immediately. As the cameras cut away, viewers caught a glimpse of Carson physically helping Gabor off the stage, her exit as unsteady as her entrance had been. Backstage, Carson reportedly summed up the appearance with typical dry wit, "She came for charm, but vodka showed up first." Despite the chaos of this particular visit, Gabor was eventually welcomed back to The Tonight Show, though future appearances were reportedly scheduled earlier in the day, whenever possible, a scheduling strategy that staff referred to as the Zsa Zsa protocol. What made Gabor's drunken appearance particularly memorable wasn't just her condition, but the way it amplified rather than diminished her existing persona. Where some celebrities became entirely different people under the influence, Gabor simply became an exaggerated version of her public self, more flirtatious, more outrageous, and more uninhibited in her pursuit of attention. It was Zsa Zsa Gabor turned up to 11, for better or worse, with Carson along for the increasingly wild ride. In the pantheon of notoriously intoxicated celebrities, few names carry the legendary status of Oliver Reed, the British actor, known for powerful performances in films like Oliver and Women in Love, had earned an international reputation for his prodigious drinking and unpredictable behavior, a reputation that eventually made him the rare celebrity considered too risky even for Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Unlike the other entries on our list, Reed never actually made it onto Carson's couch, a distinction that itself speaks volumes about his notorious status. According to multiple NBC sources, Reed was booked to appear on The Tonight Show in 1973 to promote his role in The Three Musketeers. However, as the broadcast date approached, reports about Reed's recent behavior on other talk shows reached Carson's producers, triggering unprecedented concern. Reed had recently appeared on several British chat shows in various states of intoxication, creating moments of television that were alternately hilarious and horrifying. On the BBC's Parkinson, he had performed impromptu gymnastics before calling the host a duller version of The Real Thing. On the Russell Hardy Show, he had emptied a glass of whiskey into a potted plant after declaring it too weak and demanding stronger refreshment. Most alarmingly, on an Australian program, he had reportedly threatened to remove his trousers if the host continued asking questions about his drinking habits, a threat he began to make good on before the broadcast hastily cut to a commercial. These incidents created serious concerns for the Tonight Show's producers, who brought their reservations directly to Carson. According to former NBC executive Dick Ebersol, Carson reviewed tapes of Reed's previous appearances and made an unprecedented decision to cancel the booking altogether rather than risk an uncontrollable situation on live television. This decision was especially remarkable given Carson's usual approach to potentially difficult guests. Rather than avoiding controversial figures, Carson typically welcomed them, confident in his ability to manage even the most challenging interviews. His willingness to draw a line with Reed spoke volumes about just how unpredictable the British actor was considered to be. The cancellation created its own minor controversy, with Reed publicly declaring that American television was too bloody timid and suggesting that Carson was afraid of a real man on his precious show. These comments might have burned the bridge permanently, but Carson, ever the professional, reportedly kept the door slightly open, telling his booking team that Reed would be reconsidered after he demonstrates he can appear on television without becoming the headline. That opportunity never materialized during Carson's tenure. Reed's reputation for alcohol-fueled antics only grew throughout the 1970s and 1980s, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where his behavior became so expected that he seemed to feel obligated to live up to it. By the time he achieved a career renaissance with his role in Gladiator in 2000, Carson had long since retired from The Tonight Show. What makes Reed's non-appearance particularly significant is how it reveals the invisible boundaries of what even the most tolerant talk show would accept. In an era when intoxicated celebrities were relatively common on late-night television, Reed represented the outer limits of guests, whose unpredictability exceeded even Carson's considerable abilities to manage on-air chaos. As one former Tonight Show writer succinctly put it, he drank like it was his job and talked like it wasn't. This observation captured the essence of why Reed remained a guest to Wild even for Carson, a man whose primary talent sometimes seemed at war with his even more impressive capacity for self-sabotage. Peter O'Toole occupied a unique position in Hollywood, a classically trained actor of extraordinary talent, who was equally famous for his epic drinking exploits. The star of Lawrence of Arabia and seven-time Oscar nominee brought to The Tonight Show a fascinating combination of Shakespearean eloquence and unpredictable behavior that made his appearances both intellectually stimulating and somewhat nerve-wracking. For Carson's production team, unlike some celebrities who attempted to hide their intoxication, O'Toole approached his drinking with the same dedication he brought to his craft, with full commitment and without apology. His Tonight Show appearances typically occurred after he had enjoyed what he called a proper lunch, his euphemism for an afternoon of sustained Scotch consumption. His most memorable Carson appearance came in 1978 when he arrived to promote Caligula, already a controversial film, before its release. Backstage staff noted that O'Toole was well lubricated before the broadcast, having apparently spent much of the afternoon in the hotel bar across from the NBC studios. Nevertheless, he was coherent and charming during the pre-interview, leading producers to believe the segment would proceed normally. When O'Toole walked on stage, he initially appeared composed, his natural grace and theatrical training allowing him to navigate the short distance to the guest chair with reasonable stability. The first hint that the evening might take an unusual turn came when, rather than waiting for Carson's initial question, O'Toole immediately launched into a critique of the studio lighting, suggesting it was designed by someone with a profound hatred of human skin tones. Carson, amused rather than offended by this observation, smoothly transitioned to a question about O'Toole's latest project. Rather than providing the expected promotional response, O'Toole embarked on a remarkably articulate but entirely tangential discourse on the decline of classical training in modern actors. This 7-minute improvised lecture, delivered with perfect diction despite his intoxication, left Carson alternately impressed by O'Toole's erudition and frustrated by his complete disregard for the interview's intended direction. Throughout the segment, O'Toole exhibited a fascinating pattern. He would drift into seemingly disconnected anecdotes, appear to lose his train of thought entirely, then suddenly snap back with razor-sharp observations delivered in perfect theatrical English. The effect was like watching someone repeatedly fall asleep at the wheel, only to awaken with the reflexes of a Formula One driver, narrowly avoiding disaster each time. The interview's most surreal moment arrived when Carson mentioned O'Toole's well-known passion for fencing. Without warning, O'Toole leapt to his feet, grabbed Carson's pen from the desk, and assumed a perfect in-guard position. "Stand up, Johnny," he commanded. "I shall teach you the basics of the noble art." Carson, caught completely off guard, but always game for unexpected moments, cautiously stood and allowed O'Toole to demonstrate proper fencing stance and technique using the pen as an improvised foil. This impromptu fencing lesson continued for nearly 3 minutes, an eternity in television time, with O'Toole becoming increasingly invested in his role as instructor. The audience roared with delight as Carson awkwardly attempted to follow O'Toole's commands, to lunge with conviction and parry as though your virtue depends upon it. The segment, which had begun as a standard celebrity interview, had transformed into an unplanned physical comedy routine, punctuated by O'Toole's genuinely informative commentary on swordsmanship through the ages. When they finally returned to their seats, O'Toole seemed to have forgotten entirely about the film he was supposed to be promoting. Instead, he began reminiscing about drinking competitions with his friend Richard Harris, describing in vivid detail a 3-day bender in Dublin that involved temporary ownership of a racehorse. Carson, recognizing that any attempt to redirect the conversation would be futile, simply became an amused audience member himself, allowing O'Toole's storytelling to take center stage. Despite, or perhaps because of the chaotic nature of his appearances, O'Toole remained a welcome guest on The Tonight Show throughout Carson's tenure. Unlike some intoxicated celebrities who became hostile or incoherent, O'Toole maintained a certain charm even at his most inebriated. His classical training and natural wit gave him resources to draw upon, even when his faculties were compromised, creating what one Carson writer described as the most eloquent drunk in television history. As another writer aptly summarized, he was a master of words when he remembered them. This observation captured the essence of O'Toole's Tonight Show appearances, a brilliant mind operating through an alcoholic fog, occasionally losing its way, but never its fundamental eloquence, creating some of late-night television's most unpredictable yet strangely captivating moments.